If you're looking for horse racing action, there's no better ticket than DK Horse. Jumping into the saddle is simple. Just choose a track from hundreds around the world, pick your favorite horses, and take advantage of daily promos, like 100% deposit bonus, up to $250. Then you can watch the races right on the app, so you'll catch every exciting second. Giddy up with DK Horse, America's #1 downloaded horse betting app. The crown is yours.
Hi everyone, welcome to this daily racing form Belmont Stakes webinar presented by DK Horse. I am your host, David Aragona, and I am thrilled to have two esteemed guests joining me today. I don't think either one needs much introduction to horse players, but I'll give you proper introductions anyway. Steve Crist, you are the former publisher and columnist for Daily Racing Form, author of Exotic Betting and Betting on Myself. You're a Pick 6 ticket construction guru, and just like our other guest, you're a great advocate for horse players. Steve, welcome to this webinar.
Thanks, David. Good to be back.
And Andy Beyer, our other guest today, author of Picking Winners, My $50,000 Year at the Races, plenty of other books that I've read and are beloved by horse players, creator of the Beyer Speed Figures, of course, and longtime racing columnist. And just like Steve, you've always been a great advocate for horse players fighting for the integrity of the sport. Andy, thanks for coming on today.
Thanks, Dave.
Well, before we get started, our sponsor is DK Horse. Just want to read off a few promos. There is a new customer bonus at DK Horse, 100% deposit bonus for up to $250. That's 2 times playthrough with a minimum deposit of $25. One per new customer, minimum $25 deposit. First deposit matched up to $250. Deposit requires 2 times playthrough of settled wagers within 168 hours of registration. Bonus released in $25 increments. Terms at DKHorse.com. Also have some bet back promos from DK Horse this week. Get up to $10 back on your first win bet if your horse finishes second or third on all eligible races at Belmont at Saratoga. On Friday, that is the DK Horse Acorn Stakes. Bet $25 on the Acorn and earn $5 in cash bonus. Saturday, the Belmont Stakes. Bet $100 on the Belmont Stakes at Belmont at Saratoga to earn a $20 cash bonus. And on Sunday, bet $25 on the Critical Eye Stakes at Belmont at Saratoga to earn a $5 cash bonus. You must opt in at dkhorse.com for all bet back promos. Well, let's get things started, and I'll ask a couple of questions of each of you to bring you guys into the conversation. Steve, obviously, first Belmont Stakes to be run at Saratoga. I know both of you have been following this game for a very long time. I don't think you've been following it long enough to remember the Belmonts that were run at Aqueduct back in the 60s, but it is a new thing, running this race at 1.25 miles. And typically there's so much conversation with the Triple Crown races about history and precedent. Do we kind of have to throw that out the window this year with this race being run at the 1.25 mile distance?
Well, I don't think you have to throw it out, but go ahead, Andy.
I was going to say, over the years, there have been enough changes in the Triple Crown and the race spacing and distances and so on that I don't think our historical sense should be offended by a change. I don't think there's going to be that much difference between the 1.25 miles here and 1.5 miles. There might.
Steve, how do you feel about it?
We don't have a horse going for the Triple Crown, because then we'd have to have this sort of stupid debate about, gee, does this one count? Does it require an asterisk because it's different? So besides the fact that I don't think we have a horse in this race who's worthy of being a Triple Crown winner, I'm glad we're not in that situation.
Yeah, Steve mentions the worthiness, Andy. And then speaking of the Beyer speed figures that these horses have earned so far in the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness, I believe it's been a 100 Beyer for both of those races. In terms of historical precedent of past crops, it seems like it's a fairly slow group. What are your impressions of this 3-year-old crop so far?
In recent years, this is, these numbers have become the norm. I mean, back in the 80s, which now seems like ancient history, but it was not uncommon for horses to run figures in the 110 range in the Triple Crown races. I think the difference is not not so much a decline in the quality of horses, but a change in the way horses are campaigned these days. I mean, in bygone days, horses would have 10, 15, 20 prep races going into the Derby that were fully seasoned. Now when you get a horse like Sierra Leone, with 4 lifetime starts going into the Derby, or Justify with 3, there's no way those horses can be experienced and fit enough, in most cases, like to run the blockbuster numbers in the past. So I think it's just these lower numbers are just a reflection of training styles and the way horses are managed.
Yeah, we've got a horse in this race that's really going to put that test of seasoning to the limit of the number 10 Mind Frame. We'll talk about him in just a little bit when we get to the individual contenders in the Belmont Stakes. Just to lay some groundwork for our discussion, we're going to start by talking about each horse in the Belmont Stakes. We plan to talk about a couple of other races on this Saturday card after we finish talking about the Belmont contenders, those being the Woody Stevens Race 8, that Grade 1 going 7 furlongs, as well as the Grade 1 Met Mile. Both dirt races. There was some uncertainty about whether or not the turf course is going to be in tip-top shape for Saturday. We've got our fingers crossed. I think there's still some rain predicted on Friday and Saturday, but not nearly as much as it would appear early in the week. So let's dive into our discussion of this Belmont Stakes. We can see the field of 10 runners signed on here, and I think we've got to begin the conversation with the number 9, Sierra Leone. And I'll throw it to you first, Steve. I think the best asset this horse has coming into the race is that he just shows up every time. He's very consistent, but as Andy was alluding to, he's not run a breakout speed figure. He doesn't have this huge figure edge coming into the race, but does that matter so much when this entire crop hasn't been running that fast?
Well, it still matters, but I think really the distinguishing thing about Sierra Leone is he's the best horse in the race. To me, it's not even close. And I think that, we all like to try to be clever and take positions against favorites when it's appropriate. I just really can't poke any holes in this horse. I don't think the rest of this group is very good. And I'm sorry, it's not very sexy to say I like the favorite, but I like the favorite.
Andy, what was your take on the Kentucky Derby? I know there was a lot of discussion after that race about who actually ran the best race among the top 3 finishers. Mystic Dan obviously saving all that ground, that bumping match between Sierra Leone and Forever Young. Did you feel like any one of them was more compromised than the others?
Well, no, but I mean, we can say that Sierra Leone maybe had the best trip in the history of horse racing. They run that race again, and he's not going to win it. I mean, Sierra Leone and Forever Young, with their ground loss on the turn, were clearly the 2 best horses in the race, and one of them is back home in Japan, and that leaves Sierra Leone.
Yeah, and there is a rider change for Sierra Leone from the last race to this one. Chad Brown, in some of his post-race quotes, was getting very nitpicky about that ride of Tyler Gaffalione, which is handy on to stick it in the stretch and that making the difference. I think you can analyze the trip and try to find a lot of reasons why that horse might not have made up that nose margin. Steve, are you at all concerned about this tendency that we have seen from Sierra Leone to lug in through the stretch of his races, and reported that they're trying a new bit for this race? He is getting that switch to Flavien Prat. Do you just think he's the best horse and it's not going to matter on this day in a smaller field? Or is it something that is kind of nagging in the back of your mind?
I wouldn't say it's nagging. I actually think both of these changes are positives for him. Apparently, this bit will give the rider more control, and no knocks at all on Tyler Gaffalione, but Pratt is really, really good. I played Santa Anita a couple of winters ago, and the way that he dominated that riding colony out there really was something to behold. I think he's a terrific rider, and he and the bit can only move up what I think is already the best horse.
Yeah, I think the question about Sierra Leone, if you want to have a doubt, is just his inherent running style. He has no tactical speed. He's always come from the back of the pack. And, we know that horses like that can have the flow of a race work against them. So that I'm always a little reluctant to make a stand on horses who are going to be coming from a mile behind, but he's run well every time with that style. So I think he's a standout here.
Yeah, before we move on, Steve, how are you viewing the pace of this race? Because as Andy said, Sierra Leone is a horse that needs a little bit of a setup, though he seems to put in that run pretty reliably regardless of pace. But how are you seeing this shape up? Do you think it's going to be fast up front?
I think there's going to be enough speed. What can Seize the Gray do except go to the lead? What's a horse like Dornoch going to do except go as well? Why he's in this race is a little beyond me, but I think he is going to be part of the pace. So, I don't think you're going to have somebody getting loose and galloping the field into submission and compromising the closers.
It's going to be at least an honest pace. As you say, Seize the Gray has to go, and Wayne Lucas has never been afraid of sending horses. But I think Dornoch has to go too after he got just massacred coming out of the gate in the Derby. The connections there have to have in their mind, we've got to show our speed, and he's a quick horse, and he's going to be up there too.
Well, I don't disagree with any of that. Let's talk about the Kentucky Derby winner, Mystic Dan, who did defeat Sierra Leone by a nose that day. And talking about great trips in the Derby, you could not have given this horse a better ride than Brian Hernandez Jr. did, just saving ground every step of the way and sneaking through that tight spot at the top of the stretch to win the race. He was relatively close to a fast pace, and I think I do have to give him credit for that. Andy, what do you make of his Preakness effort? Is that a sign that maybe he's tailed off a little bit? And what do you expect with him coming back in another 3 weeks?
It wasn't an impressive race to me. He got. You got to credit the jockey. He got to the rail again. Got an excellent ground saving trip, and the fact that he wasn't able to gain an inch on Seize the Gray in the stretch, was not an impressive looking run. I thought I thought he should have done better. And his win at Oaklawn earlier in the spring, he had a perfect ground saving trip too. So he's a horse that has had a lot of breaks. And when horses come into a race having won with a perfect trip or run with good racing luck, I always want to go against them.
Yeah, we talk about horses needing a lot of seasoning for the Triple Crown and lightly raced horses pointing for the races these days. Well, here's a horse that's actually competing in all three legs, but it does seem like a lot of handicappers are downgrading him for attempting that rigorous schedule. And I think the expectation around him is that maybe he's not going to cycle back up to that Kentucky Derby performance. Even if he does, Steve, do you think he's good enough to win this race?
Well, I think if he ends up in the winner's circle, and look, he's a solid citizen of a horse. And he does keep showing up, but I think it's going to mean that Sierra Leone didn't show up and the mind frame didn't go on. I think that, Mystic Dan may well be the choice if the two favorites were scratched. I think he's the next logical horse. But like Andy, I really have my doubts about his quality. And this may sound like a weird thing to say about a Kentucky Derby winner. I don't know that he really wants a mile and a quarter, much less a mile and a half. He was begging, Sierra Leone and Forever Young to come get him in the stretch of the Kentucky Derby, and instead they spent the stretch bumping into each other instead of catching him. And as Andy says, the fact that he couldn't gain an inch on a loose Seize the Gray in the Preakness, I think, is an indictment of his distance limitations.
And let me say one more thing about his Kentucky Derby trip. The perfect trip nature of it wasn't just the fact that he was saving ground, but just the way the race unfolded. He's on the rail. There's a mass of horses vying for the lead, all of whom turned out to be bums. And suddenly, in a very short space of time, all of those leaders collapsed. And if you blinked, you missed it. But Mystic Dan just suddenly found himself 2 lengths in front when all of the leaders disappeared, and he got the jump on horses who were 6 and 7 wide. So as I say, it was the quintessential perfect trip, and I don't think he'll ever have things break in his favor like that again.
Yeah, I think I said to somebody after the race, it's like he had some invisible protective bubble around him in the Kentucky Derby that prevented him from encountering trouble. It's really tough to work out that kind of trip on Derby Day, and we'll talk about some horses that were not nearly as fortunate as Mystic Dan that day. Let's move on to talk about the horse that I actually made the second choice on the morning line, the number 10, Mindframe, and he's the real wild card in this race. Steve, there is no doubt that this horse has real talent. We saw it on debut at Gulfstream when he won that Florida Derby Day maiden race by nearly the same margin. Fierceness won the Florida Derby with a speed figure that wasn't that much lower than Fierceness, and came back, did what he was supposed to do in his second start. I think if this race were the 1.5 mile Belmont, there's no chance we'd see Mindframe in there. But this race being 1.25 miles, I think it creates a situation where maybe this is a reasonable spot for him, but still, making your stakes debut in a Triple Crown race is pretty ambitious.
Well, it's ambitious, but this could be an unusually good horse. This is kind of how great horses begin their careers, with 2 performances like this. And, the race that he won on Derby Day, that got a Beyer of 97 on the same day that the, Kentucky Derby got a figure of 100. And, a horse who's only made 2 career starts is certainly eligible to move forward. So, I think people who dismiss him because of his inexperience, here's a horse who's within 2 lengths of the Derby winner in his second career start. Any forward movement here, and I think he's right in the thick of the race. And to me, beyond Sierra Leone, this is the only horse in the field who, boy, he could be a really good one.
Andy, what do you think about Mindframe? Because from a Beyer speed figure standpoint, he fits right in with these horses. He's just bucking some history.
That's true. He certainly does, but he won't be on any of my tickets in the Derby. I think this is asking too much too soon of what might be a very good horse, but he's had only 2 career starts, and in addition to his, kind of his inexperience, to be sending him a longer distance, and coming out of 2 relatively weak fields, it's just too, asking him to improve in terms of the class of his performance, and also to stretch out. It's just too much. And you look more closely at that race. Yeah, he got very good figures. His debut, the horses behind him were both maiden claimers. The race at Churchill, he's loose on the lead, going 1/2 in 49 seconds on an extremely fast racetrack. I think that if that his presence in this race is probably due to the absence of his stablemate Fierceness, and I think this is probably a case of Mike Rapoli, the owner, overreaching rather than a master plan by Todd Pletcher to win the Belmont. Just in terms of horse management, I consider this a mistake. Now, if he wins by 5 with a figure of 110, I'll say, Todd, what a brilliant move. But I really don't see that happening.
Yeah, I tend to side a little more with you, Andy, on that one. I'm a little skeptical this is the right spot for him. And I'm also dubious that he would have been running in this race, as you said, if Fierceness had been healthy and seemingly ready for this task. Let's talk about another horse that I think is one of the more divisive runners in this field, that being the number 1, Seize the Gray. And Andy, he got a respectable speed figure in the Preakness, that 100 Beyer. I guess you can question, where did it come from? Was it just the muddy track that he really appreciated? But we've seen Dwayne Lucas do this before, give his horses a lot of seasoning, cycle up to a big effort. And sometimes those horses in the past, thinking about the likes of Oxbow and Will Take Charge, they've held their form through the Triple Crown series. So I wonder if maybe Seize the Gray is just a horse that's getting good right now, or do you think he's too much of a last time was the time type?
That Preakness did not really come from out of the blue. I thought that his race on Derby Day and the Pat Day Mile was a terrific effort. I mean, I do some what primitive pace figures at Churchill Downs, and that was a really blistering pace, and he pressed it and kept going. I thought it was a terrific effort. I mean, I picked him 3rd in the Preakness. If he had a decent speed figure anywhere in his life, I might have been even more positive about him. But nevertheless, I kind of wonder if the Preakness was, a one-shot event. I mean, he did get loose on the lead against a field without a lot of speed on a muddy track. Lucas will just fire a lot of horses into tough spots, figuring every once in a while, we're going to hit with them. So I don't have a total confidence that he's ready to fire again. But his Preakness was okay, and as we mentioned earlier, I mean, Mystic Dan couldn't gain on him in the stretch, so it was a good effort.
Yeah, and Steve, I mean, if you look back at his 2-year-old form, you can make the argument that maybe he moved up on a wet track a little bit, even at Saratoga last summer. So potentially he is that wet track horse. But if he's around that 8-1 morning line in this race, do you think that's fair value on the Preakness winner?
I think that's about the right price, but I just can't get, more enthusiastic than saying, well, he has a 10 to 15% chance of winning if the others don't show up.
Yeah, he's a horse that's a little tough to assess because he is very much that one number horse that's got the competitive figure. Can he run back to it? Let's talk about some horses that were also coming out of the Kentucky Derby that finished a little further back in the pack. One of those being the number 2, Resilience. And I've seen this horse attracting some support coming into this Belmont Stakes. I guess the argument for him is that he made an early move to be competitive at the top of the stretch. He was much wider, covering more ground than Mystic Dan. Didn't really finish off the race, but maybe that was due to moving early into a fast pace. Steve, do you think this horse can have more success going the 1.25 miles in this race?
No, I don't. I mean, people I respect like this horse. I don't get him at all. I think he's slow. I think he won one of the worst memorials I've seen in my lifetime. I think that, Bill Mott's initial feeling was this horse doesn't want any part of 1.25 miles. And then changed his mind. I guess the horse is training well. And, you never know if the owners are like, oh, I don't think this field's that tough. Let's take a shot. But I honestly don't, I don't think this horse is good enough to compete with the top 2 or 3 horses in this race.
Yeah, and Andy, this brings up a discussion of ground loss and how much you really want to factor ground loss into your evaluation of speed figures, because like Steve said, he's just too slow coming into this race based on the Beyer speed figures that he's gotten. Do you ever upgrade a number mentally when you're handicapping a race because a horse went 4 wide around the turn compared to a horse that maybe got a number that's 10 points higher? That
what I'm doing trips on a regular basis at a track. If a horse has had a very wide trip, I'll say, yes, he's better than that 90. In the case of the Derby, it was such an extreme ground loss was such a factor. It really the determining factor in that race. I mean, Equibase now has ground loss data in its online charts, and based on that, with Mystic Dan saving ground, Sierra Leone probably traveled an extra 2.5 lengths, and Forever Young an extra 4 lengths, because of where they were on the track. So back to resilience, he made a kind of move on the turn that normally when you see that, you say, gee, here's a horse we're going to upgrade. But the fact that Sierra Leone and Forever Young were outside of him, and they kept on going while he was fading. I can't really give him too much credit for his Derby effort, and as Steve said, his New York performance that in that terrible Wood Memorial was not all that inspiring.
Well, a horse that also needs to get a little faster is the number 6, Dornoch. I think what you can say about Dornoch is that if you're looking for the horse that maybe had the worst trip of anybody in the Kentucky Derby, you could point to him. I mean, breaking from the rail is always difficult in the Kentucky Derby. It kind of spells trouble right from the post position draw. And I mean, he got all the trouble you might expect. I mean, not able to make the front end, getting cut off into the by the stands the first time, shuffled back, just really in traffic for the entire race. Steve, he's not a horse that I liked heading into the Kentucky Derby, but I understand wanting to upgrade him a little bit off that trip. Or do you just think he's too slow?
Yeah. I thought he had zero chance in the Derby, and I understand he had a trip, but it's not like, well, if he hadn't had the trip, he was going to be a factor. I mean, this is just a horse who, he beat Sierra Leone in the Remsen when the latter was making his second career start. And Dornoch benefited from a bias and from Sierra Leone's inexperience, but he hasn't gotten 1 inch better since then. His 3-year-old campaign, you can say, oh, look, he won the Fountain of Youth. I mean, that race was a joke after all the late scratches. It was a visually very unimpressive performance. To me, he had no excuse in the bluegrass, and I just don't think he's trained on as a 3-year-old and doesn't belong with the top 3-year-olds.
Yeah, do you think he just peaked last year?
You're probably right about him, Steve, but the bluegrass, I don't think most people recognize just how fast that pace was. I mean, 46 and change doesn't look like much, but that was the fastest pace in the bluegrass since 2006, and he was chasing it, and I think he's better than that figure would indicate. And of course, in the Derby, it was just a horrific trip. I mean, you can just draw a line through that. So I looked long and hard at him. I came to agree with your position. He just hasn't, given any sign of improvement since, last year when he was running around a 90. But, it's conceivable he's going to get a good trip on Saturday. He's going to be near the lead, and I guess I can't use him, but I'm a little afraid of him.
Yeah, I kind of had a tough time making my mind about him as well. I didn't like him going into the Derby. I kind of want to upgrade him a little bit because I think he's going to run better with a decent trip here, but a victory might still be just out of reach for him. Another horse who has to get faster is the number 8, Honor Marie, but just like Dornoch, he really didn't have the trip work out for him in the Kentucky Derby. I mean, you could say that Honor Marie was going to be towards the back of the pack anyway, but it's still not ideal to get pinballed around at the start the way that this horse did. And he just got steadied multiple times after that and actually tried to do some running around the far turn. Andy, is Honor Marie a horse that you think could be competitive here if he gets back to that Louisiana Derby performance?
I do. I mean, he might. I think he'll be my exacta horse with Sierra Leone. the competition at the fairgrounds was generally pretty good, where Anna Marie was running, and that, the horse who won the Louisiana Derby came back and finished fourth in the Kentucky Derby. So getting beat a length there, running a figure of 96, kind of puts him in the mix for a piece of the pie in the Belmont. And this is more a process of elimination. I mean, I don't want Mystic Dan and I don't want Mind Frame. And if you're gonna throw out the second and third choices, you gotta come up with somebody, and I guess it's Honor Marie for me.
Yeah, and Steve, I mean, you obviously like Sierra Leone, who is a deep closer. Anna Marie has a similar running style. Do you give him any chance at all?
I give him some chance. I mean, he's really the only Derby also ran who I like at all. I think he still has some ceiling. But again, he's a very deep closer. I mean, he's going to be behind Sierra Leone early. He has no early speed at all. And, that is just not the kind of horse that you usually want in the Belmont Stakes, even at 10 furlongs as opposed to 12. And I don't see him out finishing Sierra Leone. But could he run on and be second or third in this race? Absolutely. And as Andy says, process of elimination. I mean, half the field, I just have big X's drawn through. And he's one of the few horses I don't have a big X through.
Yeah, I think there are definitely some things to like about him. And the difference for him with Dornoch, between Dornoch and him for me, is I like this horse heading into the Kentucky Derby. Just feel like we didn't get a chance to figure out how good he was that day. So if you liked him that day, I think you're supposed to give him another chance in this Belmont Stakes. Well, let's finish up our discussion of the Belmont with the three horses coming out of the Peter Pan. The winner of that race was the number 5, Antiquarian. Steve, the Peter Pan has been a decent producer of horses that have done well in the Belmont Stakes. We saw it last year producing Archangelo, the Belmont Stakes winner. This year's Peter Pan got a mediocre 92 Beyer speed figure, 3 horses that finished within a couple of lengths of each other that are all back in this race. Do you think any of these have the potential to move forward?
They could move forward a couple inches, but I don't think they can move forward enough to be involved at the finish of this race. I thought that was an exceptionally weak Peter Pan. And, while the race and its positioning have in the past, been good, I mean, those are, Peter Pans that are run in the hundreds, not in the low 90s.
Yeah, and Andy, how about you? I mean, Antiquarian won a relatively slow edition of the race, but he is a lightly raced horse with some upside.
I would just eliminate any horse who raced in New York in 2024, and that'll take care of about half the field.
Well, I don't think we have to spend too much time on horses like the Wine Steward and Protective, given your thoughts on the winner of the Peter Pan. Andy, the Wine Steward, I think he's a horse that I might have been interested in the Woody Stevens if they ran him there. I don't know how you feel about that, because I think this horse might like a turn back, but this just seems like too tough a spot.
Yeah, I don't want. I mean, the fact that a maiden was third in the Peter Pan, I think, is all you need to know.
Yeah, and Steve, we talked about Mike Rapoli liking to have horses in big races like this. I think that's the reason why we're seeing Protective in here, who might be a decent horse when all is said and done, but I think he's a horse that needs a confidence boost in maiden company. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I don't disagree with anyone who looked at this race as an owner and said, yeah, you know what, this field really isn't all that good and all that deep, and we have some kind of a puncher's chance of running third. So, I understand these horses being in the race, but I can't take them seriously as win candidates.
So picks for the Belmont. I don't know if I want to nail you down this early, but it sounds like you guys are leaning Sierra Leone. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And for me, I've got Sierra Leone in the mix. I did pick Honor Marie on top. I just think he's going to be the right price. And like I said, I liked him in the Kentucky Derby. And I'm also interested to see what happens with Seize the Gray. I think he's a horse that is difficult to assess in here, but if he runs back to that Preakness, he could be dangerous. Well, that wraps up our discussion of the Belmont Stakes. We do want to also talk about a couple of the Grade 1 races on the Belmont undercard. Let's stick with the 3-year-olds first and move on to race 8, the Grade 1 Woody Stevens. one of the most interesting races to handicap on this entire card. It seems like these 3-year-old sprints come up very intriguing every year. You got turnbacks, horses stretching out in distance. I think this is the first grade 1 in this division, so a lot of trainers point to this race, and this field does not disappoint. Seems fairly wide open coming in. We do have a very intriguing horse in the field in the number 7, Prince of Monaco, shipping in from California for Bob Baffert. And since he's got the top fig in the field, I'll ask you first, Andy. Do you put a lot of stock in that Best Pal 103 Beyer from last summer, especially given who he beat that day and how the race has aged pretty well in retrospect?
I respect him immensely. I mean, a 103, as a 2-year-old in August, if the horse just shows normal improvement with age, can translate to a 110 as as a 3-year-old this season. I think this horse is very formidable. I think this is a terrific field. He's not the only good one in here, but I wouldn't be shocked if the Eclipse Award winner is for champion sprinter this year is in this race. And I think Prince of Monaco could be it. I mean, he's Baffert won this race last year. You look at this horse's workout line, it sure looks like they're pointing for the Woody Stevens. And, he's going to be tough.
Yeah, Steve, do you think these Baffert horses deserve respect when he ships in for the big days with work tabs that look like that? I mean, it seems like Prince of Monaco is geared up for this race. It's just, you're probably not going to get that big of a price on him in what is a very wide open, interesting race. So how are you viewing him and this field?
Yeah, I mean, I have 7 of the 12 horses open to win this race. It's really a good deep field, and Prince of Monaco, you're undeniable talent, but boy, to go 7 off this long a layoff and with other speed in the field, I mean, if he wins this race, he's really good. I don't overlook the other Baffert horse, Imagination. I like turnbacks in this race, and the source of San Felipe was really good. And, you're talking about a horse who, no, the Santa Anita Derby was not a good race. And I think they've decided, especially after the Preakness, this is not a distance horse. But I kind of like him cutting back. I think the talent is there, and you might get every bit of that 10-1 on him.
Yeah, Andy, what do you think about Imagination? I've seen some people express surprise at some of the speed figures that have come out of California for the 3-year-olds, mostly earned by horses from the Bob Baffert stable, even going back a couple of years. And, with him being banned from the Kentucky Derby, often we haven't got that true line on whether those horses sort of belong against the best 3-year-olds out there. Imagination, his Preakness, I mean, it just didn't work out. He didn't run his race that day. Do you like turnbacks like this in the Woody Stevens? Because he probably is going to get pace.
Generally speaking, I mean, the racing in California is not what it was a few years ago, and these low figures reflect that. When the Santa Anita Derby came up, like with a figure of 90, I mean, there was no doubt about the number. I mean, they're just weak, and it's Baffert, against almost nobody out there now. I mean, if with him out of the Kentucky Derby for 3 years, he probably hasn't been gearing up his horses early in the season the way he used to. So, I just don't, I just have questions about California form these days.
I sometimes have the same reaction where it seems like, so many Santa Anita maiden races are getting figures of 95 to 100, but you know what? They hold up. And that kind of brings us to Vlahos, who ran a 98 in his debut. And even though he seemed to fall off going a mile last time, I mean, that was some pace that he set in the Pat Day mile. And, with any improvement in his 3rd career start and cutting back a furlong, this looks to me like a pretty serious sprinter.
He is, and I'll tell you that as I look back on that that day of figures at Santa Anita on March 9th, that figure of 98 could have been higher. That almost every horse in that field, has come out and improved on his number. So I mean that was just a huge race. I mean the Pat Day Mile. The low number surprised me, but there was no doubt about it. There was a maiden race on that card that went like 1700ths of a second faster than the Pat Day Mile. So time-wise, it wasn't good. But as you point out, the pace was sizzling, and Seize the Gray certainly demonstrated just how important that factor that was. So I think Vlahos is, along with the Baffert horse, is one of the two contenders in here.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think if you stopped that Pet Day Mile at the 7 furlong point, that race would have gotten a bigger speed figure, at least for Vlahos, but he definitely didn't get that last furlong. Gets to turn back a little bit here. Andy, I've got a question about the number 1 Bookham Dano, and really about a speed figure that's not published in the form, because there is no Beyer speed figure assigned to that Saudi Derby. Don't make speed figures for those races out there. If you compare the raw times of the Saudi Derby to the Saudi Cup on that day, or the sprint race that ran on that card, that's a number that seems like it could have been pretty high if we were making speed figures for that race. And we obviously saw what Forever Young did coming out of there into the Kentucky Derby a couple starts later. Do you take Bookham Dano seriously based on that performance?
I just I've often gotten into trouble by trying to make too much sense out of the races in the Mid-East. But, the fact that the horse is right there with Forever Young, and Forever Young was arguably the best horse in the Kentucky Derby, I guess you've got to respect him. But, I have no questions about the fact that Prince of Monaco and Vlahos are really good sprinters and are going to run well on Saturday. So I'm not going to guess on the one horse.
Steve, before we move away from this race, you mentioned you have a lot of horses open. Is there anybody at a price that you had your eye on, maybe flying under the radar in here?
You have so many horses who are going to be in the 6 to 8 to 1 range in this race, I think. A horse like Bookham Dano you were just talking about, I certainly have open to win. I think with Irad, his price is going to be cut in half, which happens throughout New York racing. And I mean, is he any kind of a bargain at 9 to 2? I don't think so. But, there's nothing wrong with Nash. And he's a horse who could get a little lost in the wagering and, float up to the 8 or 10 to 1 range. But, I do think Prince of Monaco and Vlahos are the ones to beat. But, this race we've seen so many times, it can melt down, which kind of speaks to the quality of the sprinting in the field. I don't think Prince of Monaco is going to survive a 5-way duel that goes, sub 44 and 3.
Yeah, and that's one of the difficult parts about handicapping this race. There really isn't that deep closer that looks like it's going to benefit from the flow that also has the speed figures to compete at the highest level. So it's going to be interesting to see how that Grade 1 Woody Stevens unfolds. Let's talk about another Grade 1 dirt race on this card, race 10, the Grade 1 Metropolitan Handicap, the Met Mile. Only a field of 6 signed on this year. I would say not the strongest edition of the Met Mile that we've ever seen, but we do have a couple of big names in here in the Breeders' Cup Classic winner from last year, the number 6 White Abario, the Pegasus World Cup winner, National Treasure. They're both coming back off layoffs after having raced in Saudi Arabia back in February. They're the 2 morning line favorites. Steve, are you concerned about taking short prices on either one of these horses coming off that international trip and layoff?
Well, I mean, if you vastly loved one over the other, I think that the trip and the layoff, might make you leery of singling either one of them. I can't really pick them apart. I think they're both very nice horses. And I'm going to use both of them. And in addition, I've just always had a thing for Blazing Sevens. I don't think we've seen the best of him. And while he's not there with those other two horses yet on figures or accomplishment, I actually thought that his comeback race was visually very impressive. And he's still got a lot of ceiling. And I think if he moves forward and the other two aren't at their very, very best, he's the right third horse, especially if you're right about 8-1.
Yeah, I think he's going to be the rare Chad Brown horse that actually gets dismissed at a decent price in this race. Andy, are you able to separate those two favorites, National Treasure and White Abarrio? Do you have a preference between the two?
No, because I mean, you don't have any real recent form on either. But I mean, National Treasure, seems to fire every time. I mean, White Abarrio has, has not run a good race as a 3-year-old. I mean, his Saudi Arabia race was obviously pretty poor. But I don't know. I can't, I can't split hairs, to get 7-5 or 6-5 in this race. So, which is not a good betting race, but it'll be fun to watch.
Yeah, it just feels like it's going to be hard to get a decent value on either one of those two horses. You got those layoff questions to answer. National Treasure probably going to get the jump on White Abarrio. He's got better technical speed, and it seems like the best has really been brought out of National Treasure since Bob Baffert has gone back to having the jockeys ride him much more aggressively than they had maybe back in the middle of last year when he was inexplicably rated in the Travers. But I think the mile is going to work for him. We didn't mention the number 3 post time. Andy, what do you make of him? He's got some triple-digit buyers that would put him in the mix here, albeit earned against weaker company than what he's going to face here. It's a big class jump for him. Do you give him any shot?
He's just a notch below. But I'll tell you, Brittany Russell is a trainer you leave out at your peril in most cases. I think this spot is a little ambitious, but she wins a lot of races.
Yeah, Steve, I'm guessing you're not the biggest fan if you're looking beyond him to Blazing Sevens.
Right.
I mean, pick him
since Steve.
But that's as good as it gets.
I'll give him another look since Steve endorsed him, but I'm not sure.
Well, we wanted to save some time towards the end of this webinar to get to some questions that you guys submitted. So let's start off with a few of those. We'll begin with a question about Mystic Dan. What are your thoughts on Mystic Dan potentially being better on wet tracks? I think the forecast is looking better than it was for Saturday initially. So there's a chance we got a fast track for the Belmont, probably a strong chance. But Andy, Steve, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I didn't think his performance in the Preakness on after it had rained hard was all that good. So, I don't think that's a factor with him.
No, I mean, I overlooked this horse in the Derby because I thought it was entirely the muddy track that led to that big performance in the Southwest, which, if we'd taken the fig at face value, I don't think he'd have been, 17-1 in the Derby.
Yeah, I think the wet track is something that we were all concerned about earlier in the week. Looks like it's probably going to be fast for the Belmont Stakes. Fingers crossed. Let's move on to another question. Let's see what we got here. Your thoughts on running the Met Mile out of the chute? It's kind of a 1.5 turn race. Obviously talking about the Wilson chute at Saratoga, this being the mile race, preserving the distance. So you do kind of have that 1.5 turn situation. Steve, it's a different kind of race than we typically see for the Met Mile. Does that factor into your handicapping at all?
Not really. I mean, it is different, having the little, dog leg turn at the start. But I think the two favorites may be better horses at 2 turns than at 1. You might even say, well, it helps White Abarrio a little. His 2 giant performances were in 2-turn races. So, but I don't think it's really going to affect the outcome this year since it doesn't, help or hurt one at the expense of the other.
Yeah, Andy, we saw some of those Wilson Shoot races last summer. Did you notice any trends in those races that you would take away for the Met
my
Mile?
business partner, Mark Hopkins, does our figures for New York, and the mile races at Saratoga drive him crazy because on that kind of dogleg to the start, the jockeys are very cautious, and you don't see horses blasting out of speed horses blasting out of the gate, and so often these races can it can affect the final time, and the figure. It just creates a little ambiguity, but so I don't know what that all adds up to, but when we do the figures for those races, it's often a head scratcher.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see any of those 44 and change half miles that we've sometimes have seen in Met Miles past with that Wilson Shoot. Let's take a look at another question that was submitted. Steve, do you have any thoughts on these 2-day pick 6 or pick 5 wagers? I like the idea, but scratches cost me a lot of extra money at Pimlico and seem to not end up being a smart wager. How do you feel about those 2-day wagers?
The jury's still out for me. I got involved in one of the 2-day things at Pimlico. And tried to go sort of narrow on day one, so that I had to play it that, hey, if I'm really right on these first 2 or 3 races, well then I've got some possibilities and some spread races on day 2. If you don't like the 1-day sequence, but someone was asking me, what do you think the pool will be for the 2-day pick 6? I have absolutely no idea. So these bets are still in their infancy. I'm glad people are trying some new things, but I haven't had enough experience with it to have a firm opinion.
Andy, any feeling on the 2-day wagers?
I yield to Steve on all pick 6 questions.
Let's look at another question. With rain expected on and off all weekend, do you make any adjustments to your bankroll or handicapping? I think we kind of touched upon what we expect the weather to do on Friday and Saturday, but let's say that there is an unexpected rainstorm in Saratoga, which we've definitely seen happen before. How would you make adjustments, especially just for the dirt racing if the track comes up wet? Would you change the volume that you're wagering, or would you change some of the handicapping you did ahead of time? Andy, I'll start with you on that.
I don't know. I mean, obviously you look for horses who might have an affinity for a wet track, but you also want to make a judgment on whether the rain has affected the way the track plays or not. I mean, often that can be ambiguous, but sometimes after a rain you'll get a resulting big speed favoring track. So you just have to keep your eyes open.
Yeah, these are very long days of racing. Remember, I mean, I think Saturday the first race is at 10:45, and the Belmont is 8 hours later. So if you see front runners win the first 2 races, on a somewhat wet track, don't go, Golden Speed rail track today, got to be in front. So be a little measured in that judgment. To me, it's just as important for the grass racing. And just as a blanket statement, if the turf seems soft yielding, that's only going to help the Europeans who have more experience on those kind of courses.
Yeah, definitely. Another question. How do you think the Belmont Stakes will play out with both Mystic Dan and Seize the Gray having inside posts? I guess we'll talk about that with regard to pace and trip. We talked about pace a little bit in our discussion of the Belmont Stakes earlier. How are you viewing trips for maybe those 2 horses or anybody else really mattering for their chances?
Well, I think Seize the Gray is certainly going to go almost regardless of what post he's in. And I guess I would imagine Mystic Dan will try to save ground all the way. It seems to be a good strategy for him.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Steve, any thoughts on trips for the Belmont?
No, I think it's a good draw for Mystic Dan, but if he'd drawn the 10, then he might have to spend, the first half mile of the race getting over to the rail, which is where he wants to be. But here, I think he'll get it pretty easily with Seize the Day, going in front of him.
Yeah, it seemed like Ken McPeak was very pleased with that post-3 draw for Mystic Dan. Let's take a look at another question. I am looking for a single in my Belmont pick 4 play, going deep into the Belmont, so I guess they're spreading in that race. Suggestion for a standout in races 9, 10, or 11. Well, we already talked about the Met Mile. We veered away from the 2 turf races in the sequence, the Jaipur and the Manhattan, just some uncertainty about what the turf condition is going to be. As you were kind of alluding to, Steve, there are some European horses in that Manhattan. So if the turf comes up wet, maybe you want to go towards those. The Jaipur seems like a fun race to have in the sequence. I know you might have a personal rooting interest in that race, but it's a fun race to handicap.
As a co-owner of Thin White Duke, I'm barred from playing the pick 5s, most of the pick 6, whatever. But I'm telling you, don't leave out Thin White Duke. I know he's 30-1 on your line, but this is his track and distance. We were thrilled when it occurred to us that the Jaipur was going to be 5.5 at Saratoga instead of 6 at Belmont this year. He's training very, very well. He's been right there with the best turf sprinters in America on his best days. So don't leave him out at 30-1.
And Andy, any thoughts on the Manhattan or the Jaipur? I don't know if you've done much handicapping.
No, I was waiting to see what the course and weather are like before expending too much mental energy on those races.
Yeah, speaking of that pick 5 sequence, I mean, it starts off with 2 really tough races, the Woody Stevens and the Jaipur. I think they're 2 of the more wide open races on the card, so definitely spots where you might want to look for a price. Maybe Thin White Duke is one of those. Let's take a look at another question. Would the both of you concede that you can be a great speed figure maker and you can be a very good bettor, but it probably is not enough to beat the CAWs? Andy, I'll go to you first on that. I know you've talked extensively about CAWs recently, but also in the past. Touch upon that.
Well, it is clearly much more difficult, to win at the track these days, because of their presence. I mean, I think their operations are a little mysterious to most of us. But years ago, I talked to a couple players overseas who had used that methodology long before it came to the U.S., and their level of sophistication is really staggering. So it's the game is a lot tougher than it was when I had my speed figures and written in with a red flare pen and nobody else had them.
Steve, if I could narrow down this question for you a little bit, I mean, we all see the late odds changes in the win pool that gets everyone upset. Would you say that the CAWs being involved in the multi-race wagers, like the pick 5s, pick 6s, maybe that's not such an issue at the New York Racing Association because they obviously restrict CAW play in the late pick 5 pool and some other pools. But has that changed the way you approach the multi-race wagers, having them in the pools with you?
Definitely. And most of my play is NYRA. And to me, there's a huge difference between the early pick 5, where you do have the CAW players in, and the late pick 5, where you allegedly don't. You can't control individuals' behaviors. But, I mean, you can see every day that the early pick 5 has a much higher handle than the late pick 5, even though the late pick 5, has better races and bigger fields. So that's obviously the CAW play. And as Andy said, they've made a tough game tougher. I mean, I think that people have the misimpression that, these guys have figured out the secret to horse racing and, they're winning big and they've beaten the game. Well, they're operating on very, very thin margins. What they've done is found a way to, kind of send money in the pool and get back 95% of it. And then you add on a rebate and, you've got a profitable operation. Unfortunately, when you have guys getting back 95% of their money, the people who were getting back 80% of their money are now getting back 65% of their money. And, you do the math and it's a little scary how much of the whatever juice remains in the pools is being sucked out.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that point. I think if you're playing the races these days, it really benefits you to have some understanding of how the CAWs operate and not just view them as this force that you can't possibly beat, because you do view patterns and things like that, and you definitely want to be aware of which pools you're getting involved in, but definitely something that could generate a lot more conversation if we had more time for it. Let's look at another question. Should Sierra Leone have been disqualified back to third in the Kentucky Derby? I think we might have a consensus on this one, but I'll let you guys take it.
Yes.
Probably.
Steve, yeah. Yeah, at the very least, I think just for integrity purposes, the stewards should have looked at it. What decision they would have made, who knows? But I think you're at least supposed to hang up the inquiry sign in that situation. Let's take another question. We always hear that the American racehorse is bred for speed, but it doesn't seem like the breed is getting faster. There are track records that are 20 years old. Is the breed getting slower? I think this is the last question that we have. Since it's sort of a speed figure-centered question, I'll ask you first, Andy. Are horses getting slower, and why do you think they're getting slower?
Yes, one of the most kind of stunning developments in the sport to me is the low figures for sprint races. I think like 105 is like a big number for stakes sprinters these days. And back in the old days, good American sprinters would run 120. I don't know what has caused the change. I mean, we're certainly, our breeders are still breeding for speed, but the relative disappearance of great sprinters is a mystery to me.
I would, agree, and only temper it by going back to what Andy was talking about earlier, which is the very different way that horses are campaigned now. I don't know. If you looked at horses' 20th career start, in the past and now, would they really be that different? Or is it that, as we see so obviously in the Triple Crown with so many horses, making their 4th career start instead of their 14th career start, of whether it's just the lack of experience and toughness and seasoning, the lack of racing these horses as 2-year-olds. It's been pretty definitively proven that the more you run horses at 2, the better they are at 3, rather than worse. I don't know that genetically, there's been enough time for the American racehorse to get slower, but racing's almost unrecognizable compared to the way horses were campaigned 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, definitely big differences there in the campaigns and the speed figures those horses are earning. And that's a great point you made about the sprinters, Andy. I've definitely noticed that as well. It just seems like connections don't value having a good sprinter as much as they do a horse that can run the classic distances. Those races are worth something too, and they're championships available, but we've definitely seen a lot of turnover in that division in recent years. Well, I want to thank both of you for coming on. This was a really interesting and enlightening discussion about this Belmont Stakes Racing Festival on Saturday. Before we wrap up, just want to let you guys know again about a couple of promotions we got going on with DK Horse, a new customer bonus, 100% deposit bonus up to $250. That's 2 times playthrough with a minimum deposit of $25. 1 per new customer, minimum deposit $25, with a first deposit matched up to $250. The deposit requires 2 times playthrough of settled wagers within 168 hours of registration. Bonus released in $25 increments. Terms at dkhorse.com. Also, some bet back promos from DK Horse. You can get up to $10 back on your first win bet if your horse finishes 2nd or 3rd on all eligible races at Belmont at Saratoga. On the Friday card, bet $25 on the DK Horse Acorn Stakes to earn a $5 cash bonus. On Saturday, $100 on the Belmont Stakes to earn a $20 cash bonus. And on Sunday, bet $25 on the Critical Eye Stakes at Belmont at Saratoga to earn a $5 cash bonus. You must opt in at DK Horse for all of those bet back promos. Like I said, thanks again to both Andy Beyer and Steve Crist for coming on. This was a great discussion. Got plenty going on at DRF this week. Subscribe to the Daily Racing Form YouTube channel for great videos, analysis from Dan Hillman, Mike Beyer. We've got clock reports from Mike Welsh, betting strategies, DRF packages on drf.com. A lot to check out there. Thanks again to everybody for listening, and good luck playing the Belmont Stakes Racing Festival this upcoming weekend.
If you're looking for horse racing action, there's no better ticket than DK Horse. Jumping into the saddle is simple. Just choose a track from hundreds around the world, pick your favorite horses, and take advantage of daily promos, like 100% deposit bonus, up to $250. Then you can watch the races right on the app, so you'll catch every exciting second. Giddy up with DK Horse, America's #1 downloaded horse betting app. The Crown